So welcome everyone. I am so glad that you're here to support authors and local readers and of course grassroots books. I'm Ashley, the events and social media coordinator for Grassroots. And tonight we have author and OSU professor Ben Mutschler to read from and discuss The Province of Affliction, Illness in the Making of Early New England. So a quick introduction for Ben. Even though most of you seem to know him pretty well. Ben Mutschler is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University, where he teaches courses on early North America, the American Revolution, and early national period, and the history of disease and disability. He is author of The Province of Affliction, Illness in the Making of Early New England from University of Chicago Press, and at work on a book exploring the ways in which questions of ability and disability figured into a larger discussion about citizenship during the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. Prior to life, Ben was a professional jazz musician in the Boston area, and he plays with a trio in Corvallis. So here's the way that tonight's event is going to work. It'll be really flexible, open to change, but really broadly, Ben is going to start by leading a reading and presentation from his book, and then at some point toward the middle, we'll open up the floor for some questions, then Ben will speak some more, and then we'll have some more questions toward the end. Please feel free to use the chat box to indicate if you have a question during any point in the presentation, and we'll be using that to sort of run the Q&A and for Ben to see and get a discussion going. And of course, you're welcome to use the chat for any other purpose as well. Also, I want to note that the link to buy Ben's books will be in the chat shortly. I highly encourage you to buy them from us. Not only will you be supporting Ben as an author, but also Grassroots is a small local indie bookstore that is able to bring events like this to you. So all that being said, Ben, feel free to take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Ashley. And thanks to you and Grassroots for hosting this. I have to say that it's so amazing to see everybody out there. You know, I suppose we're in search of silver linings given COVID and our separation, but this is decidedly one of them, to see so many people in a way that would have been impossible otherwise. So I really appreciate you coming out, and looking forward to sharing a bit about the book and hearing from you. As Ashley said, you know, I'd like to kind of play this by ear. I'd like to, you know, start by telling you a bit how I got into the book, and a little bit about the structure of the book. I'll read some passages from it, but I invite you to, at any point, as you have questions, you can raise your hand actually or virtually. If you don't know how to do the virtual, there are 3 dots there in your on your screen, and you can click on that and find your virtual hand. It's a toggle function, so once you hit it once, you have to hit it again for it to go down. And we'll just play it by ear and see what we can do, as if we were sort of casually downtown at Grassroots having a chat together. So let me launch into this about the book. This is a book about illness in everyday life in early New England from the late 17th century to the early 19th century. And you might think, given COVID, that this is sort of what inspired an inquiry like this. But in fact, this started many years before, when COVID wasn't even a twinkle in our eyes and masks were not upon our faces. And I wanted to talk to you just a bit about how historians sort of think about how to launch a large project. And there are different ways to do it. One of them is that you sort of know what you're interested in at the outset, and you sort of work from the outside in. You might be interested in particular people, say the founding fathers, or a question like slavery, enslavement, and so forth. And then you go to the standard sources at the time and start to unfold them and figure out what you can add to the literature. But there's another way of doing this, and this is the way that I worked, which was to start without any particular preconception of what I wanted to find, but rather just to read around in the sources from the time period. Historians call them primary sources. And I'm interested in the 18th century. And so I started to read and found in all sorts of sources references to people being sick. Now, you might figure you'd find this in diaries and correspondence, but it was also true in newspapers and almanacs and church records and legal records and governing bodies at all levels. This is something that permeated discourse in the public. It's something you find in poetry. What you find is in sort of the governing metaphors of the time. Think about Madison's Federalist 10 and the diseases of the Republic being able to be cured by the Republic itself. And so for me, this is what launched me into the project. Now, there's nothing new when you do something like that in finding sickness. It's not as if I was on to something that nobody known. That's well known that people were sick in this earlier period. But the question was how to approach the material. And there were a lot of different kinds of works on this. There have been, and there continue to be. Some are in the history of medicine, which has expanded out quite a bit. This looked initially at physicians, has expanded in a social history of healing to all sorts of other healers of various sorts, and looks at their works and trying to help the ill. And that was intriguing to me, but because there was so much work done on that, I didn't go that route. And the words that were used at the time, as people described what they're up to, weren't always talking about healing. In fact, they were just talking repeatedly about the problem of sickness in their lives, something that they were keeping track of, trying to monitor, checking on, seeing who else was sick around them. Another way of looking at this would be to think about the costs of sickness. And sometimes if the historians looking at this have gone right to the question of mortality. That is, that any given sickness can lead to death. And of course, this makes good sense when we look at the early modern period. The mortality levels then are substantially higher than we have today. The case fatality rate for smallpox, which coursed through 18th century life, I've got a chapter on smallpox, could be as high as 30%. When you think about COVID today, in aggregate, maybe a little below 1%. So vast differences in mortality rates. Or take childhood mortality. You know, maybe half the deaths in colonial New England were children under the age of 11. Maybe as many as a third, a little less of children of people would die before age 20. It depends on where you are in New England and where the sampling happens, but these are very high death rates to reckon with. And yet, when you look at the language, and this is sort of maybe a cold thing to say, the overall experience of people is not death. It's rather, the majority experience is for people to get sick and then recover. It's the episodic, ongoing experience of being ill. And when you look at it that way, and you focus on the language, there really comes to be a kind of social way in which illness gets wrapped up in ideas and so forth. So think about the language here that's used. People would talk about in the great expanse that stretches from perfect health to death. What do they say if they're sick? They might say they're indisposed or they fall ill. Well, even something like that, indisposition implies that which you cannot do. You're indisposed in relation to something or someone. You fall sick. You go visit your neighbor. You're somewhere else, far afield, and there you are, literally dropping down. And now you're somebody else's problem as they need to confront your own illness. Then there are words that sort of accelerate the sort of intensity of illness. One could be sick. One could be dangerously sick. One could be dangerously, exceedingly sick. This kind of language, which seems to suggest actions in response to it, although it wasn't clear to me at the time what that would be. So the overall image of these records is one marching through their daily lives, doing the things that they do in health, and then getting sick and dropping out for a period of time and bringing many other people with them. And that's the kind of world that interested me most. I wanted to locate this world, everyday life, with a portrait of sickness at its center, rather than being peripheral, since it's mentioned so much. Rather, I put it right at the center, and we could see what we could better understand about society and politics with that view. Now, I put a word to this in the title. It's called The Province of Affliction, and it has several different kinds of shades of meaning here. One is that I located the study ultimately mostly in Massachusetts. I reached further to, New Hampshire and Connecticut, Rhode Island and so forth, but mostly in Massachusetts. And we can talk a little bit about that later. That had to do in part with the different sets of laws that are established in each of the colonies and states, and territoriality becomes an important issue, particularly vis-a-vis public health and laws of poverty. I talk about province also in terms of the hold that illness has in everyday life, the grip that it exerts on it, the ways in which it influences routines and relationships. So I mean it in that way. But I also mean it in a sort of difficult way to describe, which I'll do here. And I think it's an important thing, but it's a somewhat hard concept to convey. Following Susan Sontag, who wrote in Illness's Metaphor that she was, as a cancer survivor, somebody who had traveled to the kingdom of the sick, having been in the kingdom of the well. That metaphor of kingdom is a striking one. Sontag wrote and tried to uncover in that little book, which covers so much ground, about the ways in which all of the metaphors, the projections of ideas onto the sick, you know, as a cancer survivor, she found that it was so much harder to just deal with that disease when the idea of repression, for example, was foisted upon her. The idea of cancer being sort of a disease of desert, of sinful people, to put it in the extreme. And to go further with it, she said, you know, it doesn't have to be that way with these metaphors. You can also have some sickness that's valorized. She looks at tuberculosis in the 19th century, where people that were sick there were seen to be exquisitely sensible, highly feeling people. You know, to have tuberculosis might be a way of apprehending the sublime, that kind of thing. Well, Sontag said, look, when we get sick, we move from the kingdom of the well into the kingdom of the passport that all of us will need at one point in time, and we go into this other kingdom. But for my records, this word doesn't work well. Now, I'm going to pause for a second because it looks like I've paused for a second just because it looked like you froze. Are we back up and running? Okay, I'll do that as that happens. I'm busy talking about the province as a metaphor, and I'll finish up with this in a second and read. But the idea is that it's not moving from the kingdom of the healthy to the kingdom of the ill, but rather to think about a particular place where illness blends together with relations of good health. And so the province here can be thought of as something like a cultural province. Bernard Bailyn, writing about political development in early America, draws on the art historian Kenneth Clark, who says, look, cultural provinces are places that are on the periphery of metropolitan centers. Think about London, right? And in the Atlantic world, all of the British colonies would have been in the province of London. Or think today here in Oregon, right? Here in Corvallis, we're sort of a province of Portland. And Portland might be a province of New York City. We're at the periphery of it. We're close enough to see it, but we're not there. And I think of province in this way, the province of affliction. That is, we can see health in this 18th century world. We can look at that in the distance and see it. We're close enough to apprehend it, but we're not there. We're in a world that's much more complicated than that. We're a world of muscle and motion and work and industry and striving needs to accommodate the world of illness, which is people slowing down, people that are not there when they're supposed to be. It's a world of absence and delay and excuse. How those all blend together is the sort of central problem of the book, as I try to work out both the routines and what that looks like in terms of the pacing of life and the kind of social aesthetics of that, sort of what that looks like overall, and especially who's responsible for this, which is not clear in the 18th century. I trace the arc of what that looks like from the early period through the end of the 18th century, when there starts to be a new kind of discussion about who's finally responsible. Okay, so let me read just a little bit from the beginning of the book, and then I'll say a little bit about the chapters. And I'm telling you this now because I will invite your questions thereafter. We can even immediately get into it if that's how we want to go. So start thinking about it. I find that on Zoom, people are more reticent to jump in. So you're forewarned. Come ready with your questions. Okay, let me read from the just first few pages of the book. This takes about 2 minutes. And this comes from one of the most remarkable records of daily life that we have in the 18th century, the diary of Elizabeth Drinker. Drinker was an elite Quaker woman who had 8 children, 3 of whom died, married to a merchant, Henry Drinker. And her massive diary, covering some 5 decades, is something that's just an incredible record of daily life. Now, it's not a record that has her pouring out her heart, right? Most 18th century diaries don't do this. It's a record of sort of what happens and when, and in a matter of fact kind of way, she describes the world that she's in. And in 1777, there's an incident that happens in her house. And I begin with this, and this is what actually got me most interested in this topic, Elizabeth Drinker's diary and this particular incident. And I built out from this, and I left Philadelphia for New England for reasons we can talk about later, maybe. But maybe that's enough to set the scene. So here's Drinker writing about this incident where the everyday and ordinary becomes something that reveals just how close by the world of the extreme is, if we look at illness. On a late summer day, among one of Philadelphia's leading families, when the thick heat in the city could rival places well to the south, young Henry Drinker happily chomped through a piece of watermelon until he ate, quote, too close to the rind. It was an innocent enough mistake for a 6-year-old to make. But as his mother surmised in her diary, that moment of youthful exuberance had been costly, the cause of Henry's, quote, vomiting and disordered bowels, and the beginning of a serious sickness. By late August and into October 1777, Elizabeth Drinker kept a vigilant record of her son's precipitous decline and slow recovery. Henry voided, as she noted, 3 large worms and vomited 1 alive. He was unable to eat for nearly 2 weeks, reduced almost to a skeleton, she noted, and ran a constant fever. While there were promising signs of recovery by September 6, when Henry's appetite began to return, his mother judged his illness to be, quote, an inveterate bloody and white flux, a worrisome condition. She confessed, quote, I can't help being apprehensive of his falling into a consumption, which would be chronic and finally fatal. Henry had lived through earlier bouts of worms and bloody mucus-laden stools, and in his suffering and recovery, he was typical of many children at the time. But his mother had seen enough illness in her family to fear the worst. At age 42, Elizabeth Drinker had already lost 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. The first, little Henry, named after his father, had died as an infant in 1769. Drinker viewed young Henry's progress in the coming weeks with a mixture of optimism and restraint. A promising morning was followed by a discouraging night. Henry's appetite continued to increase, but his fever remained, and his bowels could come down, as she noted, in a frightful manner, as they had on September 15th, when they appeared red, bloody, and inflamed and cast a bitter smell throughout the room. There were continuous calls to the pot, a steady administration of clysters, that is, enemas, and other physic that Drinker appears to have applied both on her own and in consultation with physicians, and above all, a good deal of careful watching and waiting. Finally able to have his breeches put on and walk across the room with the help of a servant who had been charged with carrying him about the house, Henry suffered another setback at the end of September, quote, taken off his feet again by pains in his hams, and a cold brought on by the autumn chill. It was not until October 26th, 2 months after his initial sickness, that Elizabeth Drinker could signal Henry's full return to daily affairs. On that day, Drinker joined her sister, her 3 healthy children, and Henry at Quaker meeting, noting with relief, quote, the first time of our little Henry's going since his recovery. And here's the take-home point of this. Troubles had all started in Elizabeth Drinker's mind with a few errant bites of melon. As in so many other incidents in early modern life, the thin membrane separating the workaday world and the world of perils had been too easily punctured. Oops, I see you're frozen again. Could folks hear that last bit? World puncturing? Okay, all good. These are the accommodations we need online. So that incident got me interested in this. Now look, Drinker describes a lot in these entries, and Henry is just one story that she's following throughout. Her husband in occupied Philadelphia has been kidnapped for a while and imprisoned. He's sort of seen as a proto-loyalist. There are the daily affairs of the domestic economy to attend to that she's writing about. There are her other children. But in the middle of this, her little son, 6 years old, bites into watermelon, and off to the races they go with this kind of escalation. Now, Henry doesn't die here, right? But in fact, his illness consumes that household for a period of time, sort of takes over for a moment, and needs to be incorporated in with all of the other kinds of things that are done. There are other incidents in Drinker that start off, as I was reading them, seeming humorous. Another child takes a pea at one point and sticks it up the child's nose, and you think, gee, this is what a silly thing, and you've seen your own children do this. But then within a week, everybody's panicked, and within two, they fear that that child may die. So that kind of difference that they have living in that world of sort of intense anxiety, thinking that things can escalate so rapidly into something much worse and then resolve and everything goes on as normal. That's what I'm trying to recover. All right, let me say a few words about the structure of the book, some of the chapters in it, and then open up for questions now. And there's other kinds of things I've got. I can do more reading. I've got documents to show, whatever we want to do here. So the book has an introduction and an epilogue, and then is 8 chapters. And in the first section, I try to set out some overviews of what seems to be at stake in this world that I'm trying to create. And the first way I do this is to take a single day in October 1769 and just look at how different people on that day are reacting to illness. And through doing that, I sort of give a portrait of the province as a whole. I'm able to draw on some of the things that I don't talk about too much in the rest of the book, like healers, for example, and some of the religious frames of illness, which are gestured throughout, but not something that I dig into in any great depth. And I also show through that while people are watching through the night, and while there are meetings that are canceled and turns of people not being able to sleep and having blood that needs to be examined, that in Boston, at the same time, there's a smallpox epidemic that they're trying to tamp down on, an outbreak. There's an imperial crisis that gets smallpox bound up in it. And so we get a portrait of sort of just from one day, what it might be like to live in this period. Then I have another overview that tries to look at the great gulf that separates those that are poor and not connected to community from those that are well connected, that kind of spectrum of responses. And as it turns out, the fewer social connections one had and the less money that you had, the more likely it was actually that you were going to be charged money for your particular care. And we could talk about how and why that turned out to be. But in a money scarce economy where it's hard to come up with money, it's not an easy thing here. People that were socially isolated were those most likely to actually get charged for their care and to go into debt. And that gets sort of implicated in the poor laws of the time. Then the book's divided into 3 sections. The first looks at people that are doing pretty well, and I have it under the heading of competency. That's a word at the time that means a kind of middling level of subsistence. And so I look at families and households and the distinction between the two of people that are the competent, that is able to achieve this middling subsistence. Now, the difference between family and household is something that emerges clearly in illness, but is kind of confusing at the time when you read the records. You're in somebody's household if you live at their house. You're in their family, but you may actually not be living at their house. And New Englanders, as Laura Ulrich says, used to trade, for example, daughters as they did tea kettles. You'd farm out your younger children, have them learn a trade elsewhere. Many people in your blood family were far afield. And for historians looking at this, they'd say, well, in effect, then sort of family and household were blended. Illness lets us test that out. And we see what happens when somebody who is a servant and who's sick, or an apprentice is sick, how long that relationship between the master and servant can last, where the master is supposed to protect the servant and offer them care. Well, the master may do that for a bit, but if the servant isn't able to serve, if they can't labor, at some point the master says, this will not suffice. And they call on the family to retrieve that particular person. And debates ensue, and we find this getting litigated in the courts and so forth. So I look at those distinctions. Then I move into a section on dependency. These are people that have been brought down from the ranks of the competent into the dependent, where they need to rely on social welfare provision. Now, that social welfare provision is always out there for people. We can talk about this later if you want. New England has a kind of elegant system for this. It's poor relief, sometimes construed by historians to be cruel and unusual, but in fact, I think, remarkable for the early modern period. People are brought into this through ongoing epidemics, and I have a chapter that looks at smallpox, but also warfare. About half the years in this period leading up to the revolution are taken up with war. What happens? Soldiers are called from their families. They go up to the Northern Theater to fight the French. They get sick. Because there's not provision in these armies to take care of them, they're left behind. This is expeditionary warfare. Who needs to get them home? That's their families that need to leave their farms and come fetch them, or pay the bills as these sick soldiers slowly make their way back home. I know about all this because there are endless petitions to the Massachusetts General Court that detail those kinds of odysseys of those soldiers. Then in the last section, I look at something under the heading of agency. This is the aspiration towards what we might think of as autonomy today, people that are supposed to be able to control the terms and conditions of their own lives. But illness points to troubles there, ongoing prospects of failure in an era that's celebrating individual success. And so I look at this in the context of pension applications of soldiers who've returned home from these wars and then asked for compensation for various disabilities. In the colonial period, these are granted. It's not large numbers of people, but the conditions for granting them expand up until the time of the revolution. That is, people are the grounds that they make the argument on, that they say they were walked through a cool river 20 years earlier, and that it had shattered their constitution, their inner endowment of strength in relation to the environment, and that years later that manifests as some kind of debility. These sorts of things were accepted by the Massachusetts General Court. And the conditions were expanding, as I say. But in the wake of the revolution, particularly as the federal government comes to have to deal with people asking for disability pensions, the federal government pushes back. And it says, we just can't have everybody saying that they're disabled because of sickness from years ago. You need to have a very specific documented wound from war in order to get compensated. So I can talk about the politics of that later if you like, but that's sort of part of this. And then the last chapter in this section looks at Massachusetts, which has this precocious social welfare provision in its poor laws. Massachusetts takes care not only of people that have a legitimate inhabitants in a given town, but also an increasing number of people that haven't secured that in a town, so-called foreigners. Who are these? Loyalists, free blacks, Native Americans wandering around in early national Massachusetts and unable to care for themselves, poor and dislocated, they fall sick. Massachusetts would field applications by these people and on behalf of towns that cared for them and pay for them. But that program expands over time and by 1820 is cut down quite considerably. So I look at that. The epilogue addresses the beginning of institutions to care for the sick poor, dispensaries that form in the 1790s, charitable institutions for the sick, and finally the Massachusetts General Hospital, which is conceived of in 1810 but doesn't open its doors into 1821. And I try to end with the idea of sort of newfangled solutions to this ongoing problem, pervasive sickness, that is animating society, taking over at various points and relinquishing its hold at other points. these new solutions wind up back really in the same place that we started. They have great promise, but in fact, they can't deliver on that promise into the early national period. And so I end with sort of on a pessimistic note in that way. Same problem, new solutions that aren't able to fully comprehend it. All right, now that's what I've got from all of my overview and the rest. Thank you. So I would love to hear from you if you have questions there. And as I say, I mean, if we have dull periods here or we want, I've got some documents I could show, I've got more reading I could do, but I think I've certainly talked a lot. And I'd love to hear from you, questions that you have. We can sort of start a group conversation here. So how about folks, if you're so inclined, don't be reticent, be your boldest virtual selves. I can see some people, and Ashley can help me out too, put a virtual hand up or ask a question after you've waved as so, and we'll see what we can do here. I see Ted Lockery. Ted.
Hi, Ben. I'm so excited for this book, and I'm so happy that we get to read it. And I was wondering if you could share with us, because I can't wait to read the conclusions and what you draw from, but I'd love to know a little bit more of the behind the scenes. Could you tell us a little story about a moment where you were doing the research, you found some primary documents, and what it felt like, and what was that moment? Could you just tell us that story, and what was the document, the person you were reading, and how did it find its way into your book?
Oh, what a great question, Ted. Thank you. There's lots of moments like this. I'll confess to something that may seem perverse, but we're among friends here, which is that in a project like this one, it sort of strains the boundaries of humanity in some ways, in that, Ted, I would get excited when people get sick. What a horrible thing. Now, historians are weird folks anyway, right? We spend our lives studying dead people and opening their mail and doing all sorts of things that we really shouldn't be doing if we were proper today. But so, when people would get sick, I would be very excited and try to, untangle this. The most exciting sources, I think, that I found were petitions that go to the general court. This is the Massachusetts legislature. And the reason that these are exciting is they're often by very humble people who can't write. It's signed with an X. You'd have to find somebody in your town or adjoining place, and they would write this out. And there's a kind of formula to it. You come with your head down and your hand out. You say, "Your Excellency," to the governor and to the council, the rest, you're a humble supplicant. But then you spill your guts and you tell the story of why you need to have some degree of commiseration. And by that, you mean head down, but hand out. I can't see where I am on the screen, but I'm showing my hand is out. And ask for money, for some kind of compensation. And in the middle of that, in that sort of stylized view of asking for help, are these incredible stories. I mean, the soldiers' stories, where they've been. Some of these people are, amazing cosmopolitans. We might think of the colonial world as quite quaint, but some of these soldiers for empire had been fighting all across the Atlantic world. And then the stories that they tell about being in communities and no longer able to support themselves and their family and that kind of stuff. That sort of thing for me was very moving, to have access to these lives that would otherwise just be completely silent to us. This is not George Washington or Ben Franklin. These are people that no one has ever heard of. And then it struck me just how incredible it was that their stories, which were taken up by committees of 2 or 3 gentlemen in a legislature, would be read not once, but multiple times out loud, in effect sort of published in that way. And I guess I'll finish with this, Ted. The most incredible thing was a reference to somebody who had sent a portion of their jawbone in with a petition. That is to show their disability, to represent themselves not only, sort of virtually a representation on this piece of parchment, but actually to have that shown in front of the whole legislature, if you can imagine what that might be like. So that was a stunning kind of thing. And I'm interested in pursuing that. I really love these petitions and may at some future point write about them. Thanks, Ted. Other folks?
If you can see it, Ben, but Anita Hell had a question in it. And
great.
You want to ask that?
Will you read that? I can't see it. Anita Hella. Okay. For folks that can't see it, let me just read. You can set me straight, but from my memory of early New England diaries and letters, there's a very thin boundary between the meanings of illness and spiritual signs, the affliction of your title near to the affliction, sin, fear of death. So from a historian's perspective, what was your reason for not going into the religious aspect much? Excellent question, Anita. Look, different kinds of answers to this. The less intellectually satisfying, the pragmatic answer was simply that that's such a rich body of material that to do that on top of everything else that I was trying to get done around tracing out these social relationships and who was responsible for illness would have made, this 378-page book that much longer. And I just needed to finish that. I also look at it throughout, but the particular discourse of this, the sort of individual drama of one examining the state of their soul, particularly in the 17th century, and thinking about illness and the meaning of that, is something that I sort of treat at the periphery, but don't dip down deep in. Part of that has to do with the fact that in the 17th century, as opposed to the 18th century, there's as Robert Blair St. George, a historian, has written about this, says it's a densely metaphoric world. It's a world where somebody like Cotton Mather can talk about coughing up his sins, or across the Atlantic, I'm blanking on the name of the diarist, I'll come up with it in a minute, Ralph Jocelyn looks at his belly button, which we would think is infected, and sees what's oozing from it as so much blackness and sin emanating from his body. That kind of density in metaphor is something that's intriguing, but I think took sort of a separate treatment for me, and that would have had me dipping even further back into the 17th century. What I do come to throughout is this two broader notions rooted in the Christianity of the time. One of them is that there is a purpose to illness, right? You find so many people, even those that would seem to be deists, who in times of crisis look at that as a moment of needing to let go somewhat of their feeling of control of the temporal world, that there's a purpose to suffering. For the very religious, it's a rebuke of God and a chance to be closer, to apprehend God in a closer way, to not stray so far. But even for somebody like John Adams, it's a chance to sort of try to get his affairs in order. So that's one kind of thing that runs throughout. And the other is this idea in New England, which is not true, as true in other places. And for those of you, and there's several of you, I suspect, that are in Massachusetts now, where I miss it and my home away from home, there, starting in 1630 with the Puritans, was an ideal of a community of perils. The notion that part of what binds community together is our collective suffering. This is something that John Winthrop talks about in a model of Christian charity, a sort of famous lay sermon of his. And the notion is that, but for the grace of God, there go I, but more importantly, I think, more comprehensively, we are invested in each other in community through our collective sufferings because we can't make it through alone. And that sensibility works its way through the entire book and starts to unravel at the end of it with sort of new institutional approaches to that. So that's as best I can come up with. But Anita, if the book could be twice as long, I'd be in there with it, maybe in some future incarnation. Other questions, thoughts?
We have one from Christopher Nichols. Also,
Chris Nichols. Okay. Would you read that, Ashley? I can try to find it.
Yeah, let me read it. Great talk and topics. Thank you and congratulations. First question, number 1. Could you please talk more about the politics of veteran pensions? And then number 2, in addition, on that final set of comments about same problems and new solutions, could you talk more about what constituted a legitimate illness in the eyes of legal and medical professionals? Then he says, you can hear first, folks, historians are weird.
All right, let me try my belt, and I may need a reminder of question 2. Thank you very much, Chris. Okay, veterans pension. So this is interesting to me, and I think, apropos of some of the ongoing struggles that we have today to define what constitutes a legitimate disabling condition. It speaks to a much larger body of material in disability studies, which has surged forward in the last, say, 20 years. I see a major practitioner of that with us, George Estrick, my good friend. In the one basic idea here is that while we all have various impairments, I notice some of us have glasses on now. In the absence of that, we might consider that a visual impairment. It is the accommodation of that impairment, which might be something as simple today as glasses, or a change in the built environment, but might be more elusive in terms of a change in our ideology, for example, and our conception of what accommodation might mean socially in a whole range of ways that finally creates something that's called disability. And that matters for these soldiers' pensions because the conditions in the colonial period that I look at, as I say, are expanding so that more and more people are noting illness from a long time ago. And they note that, it's 2 decades prior, and they're noting that, their illness has brought their families down, this sort of thing. These are accommodated within the colonial legislatures, and they're done within this monarchical understanding of governance, which is, it's a clearly hierarchical world, but the charge of government is to protect the people. The ultimate protector is the king. And in exchange for that, you owe the king allegiance, right? And that gives the people certain kinds of rights. Well, within these colonial legislatures, it's the same idea. This is why, in response to Ted, I was saying that there are some of these folks that come head down and hand out, right? That kind of idea. Well, once the revolution happens, there's all sorts of concern about pensions being a vestige of this earlier monarchical world. Is this something really that's part of kings in that world? Can a republic sustain pensions where people may not fully deserve them? So the discourse about this goes. And then there's even beyond that, some very practical concerns. These petitions filter their way up from ordinary communities to the general assemblies in first colonies and then states. But then they continue to come up by the hundreds to the first federal government, which opens its doors in 1789. They're fielding stories of individual folks throughout the whole country who are complaining about all sorts of things, including disability, and these soldiers are part of that. And so Henry Knox, who's a Secretary of War and a Massachusetts man, looks at these, and he does not make particularly a medical argument against these, but he says we simply cannot adjudicate things that have happened so far away and so long ago. We would be flooded with petitions if we did that. And so he pushes back and says this needs to be something that's done at the state level. And he comes up with something that's called decisive disability, which he says illness can't count as a cause of disability anymore after 1793, only a discrete wound in warfare. And then you need to have other kinds of documentation and so forth. So I hang on to that 1793 as a very important date. Later in the 18 teens, when Congress thinks that most of the Revolutionary War soldiers have died, they open up the ability to apply for a pension. They say, if anybody's in reduced circumstances, you can do this. You can just be poor and apply. And lo and behold, over 20,000 people apply. They had no idea this would happen. And immediately, within a few years, there's means testing that's established. And they try to figure out at that point who can qualify and who can't. And interestingly for me, it seems that these stories, which had so moved colonial legislatures, no longer matter. Because what they do is they say, look, if you've got an estate that's below a certain value, around $200, we can listen to you. If you've got an estate that's over a certain amount, $400, we're not going to listen to you at all. It doesn't matter what happens. And if you're in between, maybe the story will figure its way into our accommodation. And what's interesting to me is that even though that's so, it's essentially a means test by demonstrating how much wealth you have. You have to list everything in your household and give it a value. People continue to tell these stories. They continue to narrate, this is what happened to me, and this happened to my mother, and I was taking care of my daughter, and then I lost my job, and on and on and on. Those seem not to matter anymore to the government. It's a much more sort of bureaucratic solution to a very messy social problem. So Chris, that's answer number one. And I think that talks a bit about sort of legitimate illness. I will say that the hospital that gets created in MGH, again, you Massachusetts people, you know it well, it still is extant and doing very well. The idea there is that they're the virtuous poor, right? These are not people that you could point to and say they brought it on themselves, say through drink, for example, and there's sort of early temperance ideas that are involved here. But people that have left their homes, that are trying to better themselves, youths that are in around community who get sick and then find themselves isolated, those people, if they can be recommended by a benefactor, can get seen at Massachusetts General Hospital and hopefully get a bed there. So the idea is that these are going to be virtuous people. They wind up, in fact, seeing a whole mishmash of folks, and the doctors there wind up getting overwhelmed fairly quickly. And while their annual reports continue to be positive, and after all, they're trying to get increased funding, you wind up seeing, even at their very best, that they remove people from what they think are chaotic situations that they think are conducive to illness. Too many people living together, it's crowded, it's riotous, it's so forth. They get them into the hospital and it's a much better environment. And then what happens? They have to release them back to that same environment. So the hospital is this sort of stopgap for them, but not something that can remake society. So that's part of what's going on there. All right, long for me. Sorry about that. Where shall we, shall we do? These are excellent questions. I keep fielding them. We have, I think, maybe like 7-8 minutes or so.
So yeah, we only have a few minutes left. Maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions. I want to sneak one in though really quick. Which I actually got sent to me at noon today. It's very early. And this is from Charles Aldine, who asked, and he said, I'm halfway through the book and have not noticed how suicides may entered in for those who are either ill or paying for one who is ill and simply runs out of resources. In these times, we see a lot of suicides. So was it considered a different way out then?
Charles, Chuck, what a great question. I see you out there. Historians are interested in so many topics. Maybe it won't be a surprise to learn that there are people that have whole books on suicide. And in a recent book on this, the argument is that, in fact, yes, there are suicides. There's not large numbers of these. Sometimes they're seen in the context of drowning. And so that actually some of the earliest philanthropic efforts in the Atlantic world, uniting England and the colonies, and then thereafter the United States, are people that are trying to resuscitate people who have so-called drowned. But there's some thinking that may actually involve people who have tried to take their own lives. But Richard Bell, who writes about this, says that suicide is a particularly upsetting kind of thing in this time period, because it's a suggestion of kind of the ultimate sense of autonomy, which is being championed in some quarters, right? The idea that you should be a self-sustaining person, go out there, earn it on your own, climb the pyramid of power, write a narrative about your great success, right? Moving away from this more collective sense of community and our sufferings together. And so suicide in that context becomes especially concerning, as these are people who are outside the pale of that particular, they're exercising their ultimate autonomy, but they're doing it in a way that, for critics of this, they fear that will lead to the dissolution of society. So there aren't large numbers. It's not like there's sort of what we would think of as an epidemic of suicides in terms of, vast numbers of people in any place. But they catch the attention in newspapers, and people puzzle through what was it that happened to these people. and it is a cause for concern. Later in the 19th century, people that write about this, I'm thinking of Andrew Del Banco, who's got a really interesting book about evil, the conception of evil and Satan and how that changes over time. Del Banco and others say that we have the birth, strangely, with Enlightenment ideas and reason and choice and so forth, of monstrosity of a particular sort, of horror. You know, the earlier world, if somebody had something terrible had happened to them, you would say, but for the grace of God, there go I, right? I understand that world. I am them, in effect. And that's true even of very horrid crimes that go on, mass murder, this sort of thing. Later on, people writing about the genre of horror, I'm thinking of Karen Haltonen, for example, the idea is that is somebody else. That's not me. That's a world that we can choose. They've chosen to go in this errant way. They have that ability. And so it's pushed off as something that is asocial in a way that it wouldn't have been in the earlier period. And so in a strange way, this earlier world, so dripping with sin, in effect had some kind of collective sensibility that the later world starts to lose. And suicide is part of that. So thanks, Chuck, for that question.
I have a lightweight question.
Who is that?
Barbara?
Barbara Bowl.
Yes. Somebody else has asked a similar one. Ben, when you mentioned those stories that people are telling and wanting, asking for help, it reminds me of the GoFundMe pages that we see on social media now, where people are sort of pleading their case and asking the anonymous
I'm going to speak, but I can't, my screen just froze.
Okay.
Well, sorry, Barb. I heard you said just telling, and then the screen froze. Would you repeat that? Because I couldn't hear anything thereafter.
Your story about people coming and pleading their case with their hands out reminds me of the current GoFundMe pages that we see, where people are telling their stories and asking the anonymous public to contribute to their cause. And I just wondered, it's fascinating to me when I hear something that from the past, it feels very new in the present. And there were versions of it so long ago, and I wonder if you have, come across other things like that.
The difference, I suppose, is that earlier way of asking was built into the system of governance. I mean, good governing was protection, and protection meant that you could reach out to your neighbors, you could reach out to your town. There are poor laws that support everybody within it through local taxes, which, by the way, are quite substantially devoted to social welfare in these New England towns. You could reach out to your provincial and later state legislature. But what's happening with GoFundMe is that's not sort of part of the welfare state. It's an ancillary to it, right? It's some way that we can reach out to our neighbors, I suppose, virtually, but also unknown people enabled by the internet. And I suppose there's a resonance there of this earlier world, but the fact that it's divorced from government means it's part of a different conception of civil society, maybe. I mean, I think it's a great thing that we have it, but it differs in the sense it's not as tied to governance, I think.
Which is a symptom of a problem that people have to go outside, external to the government.
Yeah, that's right. I suppose if social welfare was as embedded into our current system of governance as it was in this earlier period, maybe that would not be as necessary. Now, lest I sort of turn the 18th century into a grand welfare state, it was not. I mean, that is a major innovation, in the 30s and 40s and Roosevelt, and big changes that go on to it. Didn't have the state apparatus and so forth. But in terms of conception, the ability to ask and the notion that government was meant to protect the people, that is central. And then I think that's something that wanes over time with small L liberal, not progressive liberal, but the sort of liberal individualistic ideas that emerge.
Fascinating.
So we are just about out of time. There are so many interesting questions in the comments. I wish I had 2 hours instead of 1 here, but I don't want to keep everyone too late. Ben, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make before we all have to get going?
Well, just to thank you so much for Ashley for having me, and to Grassroots. And I do hope this is not a plug for the book, but just that you'll visit Grassroots and support them. We need to support our local bookstores. And then such a thanks to all of you. What an amazing thing to see you. I hadn't quite envisioned what this would be like, but from my end, it's just incredible to be able to see everybody, get to say hello, share a little bit about the book. I hope that people will be in touch, you know, and it would be nice to continue on the conversation and just say hello back and all of that. But thanks so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. I'll have a few more of these sorts of things further down the line in December and January and February, and I'll let people know. But really great to see everybody. Thanks so much. It was a really fun first outing for me.
Yeah, as Ben said, thank you so much, everyone, for coming here. This was such an interesting conversation. And Ben, I truly appreciate your insight and your thoughtfulness and your time with us. To our audience members, of course, support Ben and buy his book here with us. You can by clicking the link I pasted into the chat or on our website. Your support really helps small bookstores like us stay open and bring authors like Ben to our community. So thanks again, everyone. We hope to see you for more events soon. Have a good
night.
Hey, way to go,
Thank
Ben.
Great talk, Ben.
Nice
Thanks so
job.
much.
Way to go,
Really?
Ben.
Ben, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes, congratulations.
I appreciate it.